Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is examining gender balance within the construction and property sector. Sorry, we're starting a few minutes late. By way of introduction, my name is Richard Gelder. I'm Director of Hayes Construction and Property. I'll be presenting the opening half of the webinar, which will be to provide you with an overview of and findings from the recent Hayes report, Equality Under Construction. In terms of my background, I've been in the construction and property recruitment sector for almost 27 years, working across the UK, and I'm responsible for business areas within Hayes, including architecture, building services, civil engineering and surveying. I'm joined today by Charlotte Sweeney, OBE, who is the founder and director of Charlotte Sweeney Associates. Charlotte will deliver the second part of the webinar, discussing the importance of inclusive leadership and the improvement of gender diversity within the sector. Absolutely thrilled to have Charlotte join us today. She's internationally recognised as a leading authority around diversity and inclusion with over 20 years of experience. She has produced a number of leading reports and publications and works across industry, helping organisations create inclusive workplaces. Charlotte was awarded an OBE for services to women equalities in 2017. So welcome, Charlotte, and thank you for joining us today. Finally, I'll remind you that you can type any questions you have during the webinar, and we'll spend a few minutes at the end of the presentations going over these in our quick Q&A. We expect to take around 45 minutes in total. Right, let's get started. So, as you can see from the slide on the screen, our report is focused on gender, and it's based on survey responses from over 900 women and men from across the construction and property sector. And I think a good start point to the presentation is to give you a context to why we produced the report. And it was really in response to a growing demand that we've seen as a business over the last 12 months from clients across the UK around two key questions. These are, firstly, I want to know more about diversity and inclusion, particularly from a gender perspective. What insights can Hayes share? And then the second question, what practical actions or steps can Hayes recommend or signpost around diversity and inclusion for my business or organisation? Now, we found that there are a number of different drivers behind these questions. It's not a single picture or one size fits all. And clearly diversity and inclusion is a much broader issue than just gender that I'm primarily focusing on today. But I would certainly highlight the issues that I've been personally made of, which are driving these questions include addressing skills shortages, whether short-term or long-term, improving business performance, tackling retention rates within the sector, and also concern about industry reputation and indeed perception. So, probably not an exhaustive list, but certainly a fair summary of the key themes I've consistently come across. So, as I take you through a few of the main findings in the slides today, and we'll also hear from Charlotte shortly, I hope we'll be able to answer those two questions to help shape and develop your thinking around issues of gender in the workplace and also some wider insights regarding diversity and inclusion. So, let's start to look at the findings of the report, and I've taken four key elements which I'll talk around over the next 15 minutes or so. These are, firstly, the choice of the construction sector as a career, the family context within career development, workplace inclusiveness and culture, and then finally, a quick look at the recommendations from our report, actions that you can consider as an employer. But first, let me start by reflecting on the quote you can see on the screen, which is one of the many we had from the respondees to our survey. And as you can see, this is from a female respondent working in construction management, and I think nicely sums up the situation that our report explores. Taking the first line of the quote, I think it's something we can all agree on, that there are some amazing roles and opportunities within the construction and property sector for both males and females. But, as the respondee goes on to say, more work needs doing, whether it's the image of the sector to make it a more attractive option as a career, or improving or evolving the working environment to make it a better place to work. And it's not to say that there aren't very positive strides at the moment. As you all know, there is much work in leadership around diversity and inclusion across the CMP sector that's been happening for a number of years. Particularly from the professional institutes, networking groups and industry bodies, there is a foundation to build on further. Right, so let's have a look at the first segment of the presentation, choosing a career. This picks up the part of the report that looked at the sector as a potential career choice for women and men. And again, I started with a quote here, because this really sums up nicely the challenge of perception that we face as a sector as young people consider their career choices. As you can see, this is a quote from a female respondent, this time working in civil engineering. So this highlights for me that there is a much bigger issue for consideration around gender it really starts with the basic challenge that needs to be overcome, that a lot of people see construction as a man's job. And as you can see highlighted on the graphs here in more detail, whilst there is a fairly similar percentage in terms of the balance between males and females around picking a construction industry as their first career choice on the top graph, as you can see on the second graph below it, over a quarter of female respondees were actively discouraged from entering the sector versus 12% for male. So, a couple of quick observations here. We should assume that the real-term volumes of male versus female entering the profession is likely to be somewhere in the order of 7 to 8 to 1, 7 or 8 to 1 or higher, in favour of male, given that the current female population within the construction and property sector is widely accepted to be around 12 to 14%. Secondly, that 12% of males were discouraged from entering the profession is a cause for concern too. Would we expect that percentage for professionals such as accountants, IT, procurement, and HR? You'd probably suggest not. The other main finding we identified around choosing a career was around the routes to entering the sector. As you can see from the graph on the slide, our findings indicate that more women enter the sector by the graduate-postgraduate route as a percentage in comparison to men, but there was a huge difference around entry via the apprenticeship route. This could be an area of future opportunity given the rapid growth in modern apprenticeships, particularly into technical, engineering and professional roles, but this finding highlights that historically this hasn't been a route of entry for females into the sector. We need to consider how attractive the prospect of construction and property apprenticeships are to school leavers and make steps to drive greater engagement, particularly among young women. There is now a huge amount of competition, or the battle for talent as I refer to it, particularly around STEM subjects, so real thought is needed in this area. Let's move on now to look at the second area of focus, which is career development and family. To start with another positive finding from our survey, that is that both 80% of women and men are happy in their roles, and there was no difference here by gender. This is reflective of the quote I used at the start of the presentation, that the construction and property sector offers interesting and stimulating jobs, careers that offer a positive challenge, which is also highlighted by the findings on this slide. The top graph highlights the breakdown by gender around the aspiration to senior roles, and as you can see, our responses here highlight that for women in particular this is a key issue, with 72% aspiring to senior roles, notably higher than 56% of men. The graph also highlights that both women and men feel generally secure in their careers too, but almost half of respondees, that was 43%, said that opportunities for progression were not equally available to both men and women. Now, I'll revisit that finding later in the presentation again, but starting a family or family commitments were highlighted as a key issue, which I'll move on to now. And as you can see from the slide, there is a real difference in our findings between men and women around starting a family. The key percentage that stands out is that only 4% of women took a part-time role, 4% of men rather, took a part-time role or a role at a lower pay grade versus 37% of women, a huge difference. Also to highlight that 83% of men either stayed in the same role or improved their position or pay versus only 37% of women. Again, really stark findings. This is further highlighted by this finding that 85% of all respondees, that's both male and female, believe that having children did negatively impact a woman's career. The experiences of men and women after having children is drastically different, despite their similar ambitions, as was shown on the earlier slide. This finding highlights a different issue around family, that a significant percentage of men are not taking their full parental leave allowance. This is the same trend as as many other industries and sectors, but in our report we found that almost half, 44% of respondents, believe that men would take very little or none of their parental leave. Only 16% of male respondees said they would take their full allowance. The next slide highlights some of the detail behind this. And as you can see, here are the reasons to why many men were not likely to take their leave, and 37% of all respondents said the financial impact was the primary reason. 31% also said they believe men who take parental leave may be viewed as less committed by the career. Now, there's a clear opportunity here for many employers to change this culture to become more accommodating to working parents, male and female, but particularly to encourage men to take up more of their available leave. Also, by encouraging flexible working when possible and implementing return-to-work programs will help talented professionals resume their careers after returning from leave. In a skills-short market, there is a relatively easy argument to be made that there is a win-win here for employer and employee. This is the final element I'll highlight from our report, that of inclusive workplace and culture. As I picked up earlier, right from the very first stages of considering a career in construction, expectations and experiences are different for men and women. The historic stereotype of the construction sector as a masculine industry leads to 20% of women who want to enter the industry facing discouragement from those around them. That said, there has been a move from many employers to better support women in their careers, and 62% of female respondees said that they had career development plans in place, and this was around 10% more than men who said the same. Now, taken at face value, it is encouraging that employers are making efforts to support women's career development plans. I think this is a positive indication of some of the work that has been done in recent years around diversity and inclusion within the sector, albeit, as I mentioned earlier, there is still an issue around progression opportunities for women. And as you can see from this slide, 43% of all respondees said that opportunities for progression were not available to both men and women, and in this case, obviously, all respondees is both men and women. Whilst there are positive indications throughout our findings, it's this type of insight that highlights there is significant work still to be done. This is the final quote I'll refer to, but again, I think it sums up the sentiment behind the finding on the previous slide, and I think was very reflective of many of the opinions and quotes we'd received as real-life examples of some of the statistics and findings I've been presenting. In this case, reflective of the theme that whilst women often had very positive experiences of work, and the vast majority encountered no incidents of direct discrimination, many, however, noted that discrimination is more subtle and systematic, more about attitudes and actions, as in this example. There is no quick industry fix to this problem, which will require the continuation of the cultural shift that has started to happen. However, there is a part to be played by business leaders, positive role models and supportive line managers to promote greater awareness of the challenges to overcome and the value of an inclusive culture. And finally, as you already know, gender pay reporting legislation, which has now come into effect, requires employers with 250 more employees to publish statutory calculations every year showing how large the pay gap is between their male and female employees. Whilst I won't reflect on some of the detail that we're starting to see and has been widely reported in sector journals in recent weeks, our findings did show that there is a significant difference between men and women when they were asked if they believed men and women were rewarded on the same basis regardless of gender. Over a third of women, 34%, believed that rewards are unequal compared to only 13% of men. Again, a significant difference. Despite this disparity of opinion, half of all respondents, both male and female, said they expected the introduction of gender pay reporting to have a significant or moderate impact on reducing the pay difference between men and women over the next 5 years. Time will tell. So, as I now conclude my presentation, I'll reflect on some of the recommendations that we highlight in the report. If the findings I've covered help provide some insights to the first rhetoric question I answered, this of many clients asking us the question, I want to know more about diversity and inclusion, particularly from a gender perspective, we hope these recommendations will help with the second question that we're getting asked, and that question is, what practical actions or steps can Hays recommend or signpost around diversity and inclusion for my business or organisation? These recommendations aim to help you support greater gender balance both within your organisation and across industry as a whole, thereby supporting the attraction and retention of greater numbers of talented women and men into the profession in the immediate but also longer term. So these are, firstly, be part of the movement to improve the public perception of recruitment, of construction. Take action to ensure the workplace is a welcoming place for both men and women. Consider engaging with schools and career fairs to encourage young women to join the industry as apprenticeships and upon completing their studies. Secondly, balance your approach to career progression. Assess each individual on their own merits and circumstances and ensure everyone has access to their own career development plan. Training line managers to be aware of resources to support individual needs will help keep the careers of women on track. Thirdly, take steps to make your culture more accommodating for working parents. More fathers taking extended parental leave will significantly level the playing field for female professionals too. Positively encourage expectant fathers to take this up. Return to work programs will also help talented women resume their careers after returning from maternity leave. Fourthly, help employees have the confidence to raise concerns and take action where required. Your employees should be able to share and report concerns with no fear of backlash or risk to their career. Your working environment should encourage a speak up and call out culture. HR policy should support this with zero tolerance for harassment in the workplace. And fifth and finally, improve your internal communications and celebrate all aspects of diversity. Ensure diversity in its widest sense is encouraged and celebrated. Showcase role models and stories which represent this difference and the value it can bring to individuals and business performance. So, I'll conclude by reflecting that the survey did reveal much positive sentiment about the future and some confidence in the industry, in the steps the industry is already taking. It certainly demonstrated that attitudes are starting to shift and that employers are being more proactive in their pursuit of diversity, albeit there is more work to be done. Success stories are being shared across the industry, which is becoming increasingly collaborative in its approach to improving gender balance. Celebrating those successes is an important part of making sure gender equality continues. So, thank you for your time so far. And with that, please allow me to hand over to Charlotte Sweeney OBE for her insights into inclusive leadership in construction property. Charlotte.
Thank you, Richard, and I think some really interesting insights from the research that you've done here in Hayes around progressing this agenda. I'm going to take a slightly different tact on it, but very supportive of the areas that have already been discussed, and it's around the vital role of inclusive leadership and what an inclusive leader brings to an organisation. I appreciate that we'll all be in different places on this agenda. Some of us will be just starting out. For some of us, having to report our gender pay gap may have been one of the first areas of true focus and conversation about this, about the wider inclusion and diversity agenda within the organisations. Some of us may have been on this road for a number of years and had different areas of progress, but also focusing on what's next. Where do we continue to deliver on this work for the future? I'm going to share some perspectives that I've gleaned from the last 20 years working across many, many sectors on this agenda. And one of the things I really want to focus on is this move and this focus around attitudes and action. Richard mentioned that within some of the findings and recommendations from the Hayes work, and I really want to focus on the foundations of what is actually critical for an organisation to focus on to ensure that we create change when we're focusing on inclusion and diversity. If I just reflect on the gender pay gap reporting, there have been sectors that have been working on this for decades now, if I think about the finance sector. But when you look at gender pay gap, they have some of the biggest gaps across many, many different sectors. So for me, this is about how do we set the right foundations, and I want you to take you through some of the perspectives of creating those. So firstly, if I look at the next slide here and looking at the different facets that create a truly inclusive workplace that Richard has mentioned previously, and they all need elements of all of the following. They need elements of equality, diversity, inclusion, and also inclusive behaviours. Now, some organisations have said to me in the past, oh, we've done equality, we've also done diversity, we're now moving on to inclusion. But one of the areas that's really important to articulate is that actually all of these are very different, and all of these are important assets to have when creating a more inclusive workplace. So let me just take you through each of them just to make sure we're all on the same page here. And I'm sure this will be a refresh for many of us on the call. First of all, around equality, that's generally focused around law, and that can be focused around sexual orientation, religion and belief, gender, all those different elements that we have enshrined in law in the UK and across different countries around the world. But there's an important aspect here because people make an assumption that we do have equality sorted. But if we link back to the comment that Richard made about examples of fathers not taking leave and not feeling that they have that equality within their organisation to have the right parental leave or also access to flexible working, That tells us that equality for everyone still isn't there within the workplace, and something that is a continuing moving feast that we need to focus on. The diversity element is effectively the difference, so all the different aspects and characteristics that people bring to an organisation, be it diversity of thought, backgrounds or perspectives, that is really important for organisations who are committed and feel that innovation is really important for their future. Inclusion is about making sure everybody feels valued, everybody's voice is heard, everybody feels that they can play an important part in the development and the success of their organisation. And inclusive behaviours, they're actually the behaviours that we can all display day in, day out, that actually bring all this together, that really ensure that equality, diversity and inclusion are important parts of a business. So the behaviours are really the glue that stick all this together, that we can all play an important part on. A reflection and a reminder of why this is good for business. We all know about a lot of research that's out there that really factors on the point that creating a more diverse and a more inclusive workplace, those areas where we have different views and perspectives and they feel heard and valued, has a big impact on the bottom line. And I'm not going to go through every piece of research that's mentioned on this slide, but I think an important one when we're talking about skills gap and the changing world that we continually operate in. Research from Deloitte showed that having a diverse and inclusive workplace boosts employees' ability to collaborate by 42% and innovate by 83%. And I've had numerous conversations within the construction sector over the recent months, and without exception, those organisations have talked about the importance of innovation and collaboration. And inclusion and diversity really sets that tone and enables us to deliver those. If we then look at what people are looking for within organisations, again, a piece of research that Deloitte did that really focused on culture and goes back to some of the points that Richard made earlier. There was a question about inclusive workplaces and are they important or not. And through the research that Deloitte did, they found that 80% of the people they interviewed said that inclusion is an important factor in choosing an employer. So 4 out of 5 people said that inclusion was really important. 72% of those people said they would leave an organisation for one that is more inclusive. So if we think about some of our historical thoughts about pay and benefits might keep people within our organisations, yes, it might keep some, but 72% of our people are saying, I would leave an organisation for one that is more inclusive. If we think about the different generations across our organisations, 30% of the millennials interviewed said, I've already left one employer to go to another one where it felt more inclusive. So 30% of millennials. And then finally, the key point, around 33% of people interviewed did not feel comfortable being themselves at work. They didn't feel comfortable speaking up or expressing their opinions. And Richard mentioned earlier that importance about encouraging people to speak up as part of the recommendations. This is a critical aspect because without really focusing on this, it can have the opportunity to reduce innovation, collaboration, productivity if people don't feel that they can be themselves and speak up within their organisations. If I also think about the impact on team performance, through the work I did over the last couple of years on a book that I published with the Financial Times called Inclusive Leadership, we shared this model from a consultant called Alan Richter that's based in the United States. And it showed through the analysis that he had done and others had done that there was a significant gap in productivity between teams that were like each other but were well managed and diverse teams that were well managed. And you can see that over time, once teams really got to that performing stage, the diverse teams, if they were well managed, were outperforming teams that looked and sounded alike. And when I focus on the inclusive behaviours, that'll give you an insight into what well managed meant and what those leaders were doing differently to make sure they were increasing that productivity. And the other point I want to highlight here when we're thinking about how do we truly create change, and I mentioned earlier about some sectors working on this for decades but still seem to have some of the biggest gender pay gaps reported over the last couple of weeks, is how we create sustainable change. And again, this was an area of focus over the last 20 plus years about what really creates change. And this agenda, when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, how do we increase gender within our sector, it can get very complicated and complex. There are a lot of moving parts, and it can just feel that there is too much to do. But I filtered that down to two critical aspects that organisations should really focus on that will create the change. And those two are, first of all, how many people within your organisation are engaged, so the level of engagement in really creating a more inclusive workplace. And the second one is how embedded is it into what you do as a business. So if you have a lot of people engaged but it's not embedded into the business, you end up in that box that I've highlighted there as initiatives. And that's where many organisations will focus on creating a mentoring program or putting a lot of people through unconscious bias awareness training, for example, or creating a lot of networks. Without it being truly linked and embedded into the business, that will create minimal change. The other aspect around embedding, and if I take an example on the top area there which says imposed, some organisations have gone down the route to create targets, predominantly around gender, from what I see in many, many sectors. And because they haven't done that right level of engagement with people across the business, that's seen as imposed. Because it's a target, we have to deliver, no questions asked, let's just get on with it. So the critical factor here of how we really create change is making sure we get as many people within the business engaged as possible in how do we create a more inclusive and diverse workplace, and the inclusive behaviours that I'll share in a second will link to that, and also how do we embed it into business as usual, how do we embed it into everything we do. And an example of some of those areas of where we can truly embed this is linking into some of the areas that I've identified over the years that actually squeeze that diverse pipeline, that actually reduce the diversity of the people that are within our organisations progressing through to those more senior leaders. Be that women, be that people from ethnic minorities, be that different age groups, it can have, all of these aspects can have a significant impact. And if I take you through a few examples of these, you'll see that these link directly back to the findings from the research that Hayes have conducted and Richard shared with you. So it's a combination of practices, processes and mindsets, what we do, how we do it and our views. Really create a significant impact. And let me take a few examples here. So limited development opportunities is one key area that squeezes the pipeline. Richard mentioned that 62% of women seem to have a plan around their career development, and 43% of people said there were no development opportunities for men and women. It's one thing having a plan, it's another thing actually making sure that that's delivered. But for many organisations, having those limited development opportunities really squeeze that pipeline. And people don't feel that that organisation is particularly committed to progressing their career or helping them move on, is not particularly inclusive, and then they will ultimately move elsewhere. You'll see in the slides there's a number of areas where I've put lack of. So lack of sponsorship, lack of consistency, lack of flexible or agile working, lack of transparency. And these are areas that are really important to set the tone and the pitch of where the organisation sees itself around inclusion and diversity. Now, Richard mentioned about the fact that men didn't feel that they could take that flexibility or have those parental rights around taking time out for their children. That links very clearly into that lack of flexible or agile working, and also outdated practices and processes. If we're not focusing on those practices and processes to be able to deliver, first of all, what we want for the talent we have in our organisation now, but the talent that we want to attract in the future, we're going to see a continual churn and for potentially talented people that could progress leaving the organisations. Lack of transparency, that's an area that's starting to be challenged now around gender pay gap reporting. But if you also think of different mechanisms such as Glassdoor that can share insights from people that have worked within your organisation to say what they really think it's like to work in your company. I was with one construction firm quite recently, and we were having, I'll call it an interesting debate about the comments that were added on Glassdoor. Whether the executive team felt they were true or not, one of the key aspects that I linked back to was the fact that there was a significant gap in their gender pay gap reporting, and Glassdoor wasn't particularly sharing anything positive about them. So what else would people assume externally other than it wasn't a great place to work? And we started to have the debate of, so how do we shift that perspective? How can we really focus on then moving across to that external perception to make sure that people were starting to see that organisation in a different light? The next area I want to focus on, and I've mentioned it a few times now, is these inclusive behaviours. So I've highlighted some of the key areas here that all of us can actually do. You don't have to have leader within your role or your title to actually deliver these. And I'm sure as you look through some of these, we might think, well, this is just good management, good leadership. And actually it is. But it's about doing this consistently and making sure you're doing it consistently for everyone. So I'll just highlight a few examples here. The first one is about dismantling silos. Because a lot of the time when I work in organisations, and specifically as well in the construction industry, I see lots of groups of people who are very similar to each other. And when people want to get views and perspectives of a particular piece of work or want to pull a project team together, they generally bring the same types of people together. And a really inclusive behaviour is dismantling those silos and looking for where is the talent elsewhere, where are the people that will give us different views and perspectives that might shift the way that we do that project or change it slightly. And the inclusive behaviours, inclusive leaders really focus on bringing different talent, different views and perspectives into those conversations. Building trust is really about doing what we say we will do, and I think this is an interesting one, specifically around inclusion and diversity for many companies now that we've shared our gender pay gap reporting, and many of us will have shared within the narrative available what we're going to do and how we're going to do it differently. I think people will be more interested over the years to come about whether you're actually delivering on what you're saying rather than what the data is telling us. So I think building trust is an area where we have an opportunity to challenge that external perception of us if we truly focus on making sure we're delivering what we say we will do. Another inclusive leadership trait or behavioural trait is around aligning body language with spoken communication. So this is sending the same message in what we say and what we do. And there's some great examples across different sectors of leaders that do that. Sometimes we look at examples of leaders that don't do that, and I think many people would say that many politicians are usually criticised for the point that they don't align their body language and the spoken communication, or they don't actually do what they say they will do. But a great example within business of somebody that has done that in the past is a man called Larry Hurst, who was the chairman of IBM. And he was consistent in aligning his body language and his spoken communication. He was very clear, for example, in his within IBM, that he didn't want any bullying or harassment to take place, and he would actively remove people from the business if he found out that they were bullying or harassing others, and he would make that very public. So not only was he being clear in his body language and his communication, but he was also building trust and promoting that inclusive workplace far more effectively through his actions rather than purely his words. The other area I just want to touch on the next slide is the creating a psychologically safe workplace. Now that sounds all very highfalutin, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty effective as well around how we create a really inclusive workplace. And if we don't focus on this area, a lot of the work we do around creating a more gender diverse workplace will be just an initiative. It won't really progress and won't be sustainable. And the four key facets here are creating a learning culture, So this is more about when we have challenges within an organisation, it's focusing on what can we learn from it and what are our learning opportunities rather than it being a problem to be solved. When we focus more on learning, that's when people open their mindsets far more and think more creatively about what the solutions could be. The second one is asking questions and being curious of others. Because this opens our blind spots into other people's views and perspectives, different cultures, different outlooks, and this is something that is a critical inclusive behaviour. It's not assuming you know the answers, but it's wanting to find out more about others. A key staple in any manager's toolbox is about giving and receiving feedback, and that is a critical aspect in creating a more inclusive workplace, making sure that people feel that they have a voice and they're listened to and that they can give and receive feedback to anybody within the organisation. And the final one as well is about being comfortable sharing your own fallibility, so being comfortable sharing where your weaknesses are or what we're not great at. Somebody who's great at that is Richard Branson, for example. He constantly talks about his challenge with dyslexia, but he also openly talks about the fact that he doesn't have the answers and there are people out there that are far more equipped than he is to run different elements of his business and give you different insights and perspectives. So it's been very clear as a team member or as a leader that we don't have all the answers and other people are just as effective, if not more so, than we are at coming up with other solutions. So if there was one area that many organisations could focus on to start to create that more inclusive workplace, get those views and perspectives for others, is really focus on those 4 different elements of how we can create a more psychologically safe environment. So I'll leave with 3 questions, 3 perspectives. And 3 questions for your organisations and for yourselves, and some areas that we may want to focus on within the Q&A for this webinar. First of all, what are the inclusive leadership or the inclusive behaviour trait gaps within your current leader or manager population, or for those around the organisation, because it's not purely about leaders or managers that can create that more inclusive workplace. We all have that opportunity to do that and to help people progress. Second one, where and how do these inclusive leadership traits or these inclusive behaviour traits that I've mentioned factor into your processes, such as development and behavioural frameworks? I mentioned earlier that the critical aspect is embedding this into everything we do, rather than it seen as a tick box or an initiative or something we have to report on once every year. So how does it factor into what you're already doing, and how could it? And the final one is, what are the current and future opportunities to embed these traits further? So what's already on your strategic plan? What's already on the to-do list within your organisation, and how could you actually embed and factor this into it so that we don't see this as an additional piece of work that we need to do once everything else has happened, but it's an integral part and, as I mentioned earlier, embedded into what we do. So we really can see that sustainable change. It'll really help us to see that increase in diversity at the more senior levels, be that from gender or other aspects, and we really make sure that we're tackling that aspect of an inclusive culture where people feel comfortable and open to speak up. So I'll hand back over to Richard after those thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So that's brilliant. So look, lots and lots of information there, and obviously thank you, Charlotte, and thanks everyone so far for listening in. So we hope there are insights there, and we also have some practical recommendations. We'll now spend a few minutes trying to pick up on some of the questions that come in over the Q&A. So I'll just kick off with one here. So I posed a question during my slides about the key theme that I'm getting asked a lot about, which is I want to know more. Where can I find out some information? So perhaps if I answer this first from my perspective, Charlotte, and I'll pass over to you and get your thoughts. And I think as I've learned more myself, I've looked that across the sector, there's lots of work going on. I would certainly recommend that people look at the professional institutes. I know the RICS and the ICE, among others, are doing lots of work in this area. And I would also recommend that people look at networking groups. There are some really fabulous ones within the construction and property sector, Women in Property, for an example, Open Land as well. And also I found out there's some really good work happening from a collaborative perspective. And as I've met more and more people who are doing work around either gender or diversity inclusion within the construction and property sector, I am getting this real sense that the doors are open and collaboration is happening. And I think from a Hayes perspective, as you can see, we have a link there to the actual report, but if you also look on hayes.co.uk/diversity, we also have a huge amount of information that's available. Charlotte, in addition to that, is there anything that you would recommend if people wanted to find out a little bit more or look at a bit more detail?
Yeah, I think there's a few different elements. First of all, I would encourage people to talk to other organisations to see what's happening and gain their views and perspectives about what their organisation is doing. One thing I would mention on that, though, and I call this the cut and paste strategy, where organisations think that they need to do something, go out to find out what everybody else is doing, and then have a big shopping list of all the things they could do, and then decide to do a number of different areas of that. I said it's helpful to find out what other companies are doing, but what the critical factor is linking it back to what you're doing as a business. So where does your business strategy sit? What are the key deliverables and priorities for your business? And then what actions from an inclusion and diversity point of view could you then focus on to create more change? So yes, listen to what others are doing, but really focus on what's really important for your organisation. The other bit I will mention, and Hayes are a great supporter and a founding member actually of the work we do called Creating Inclusive Cultures, which is around the country. Because we found that many drives around inclusion and diversity are very focused from a London point of view without getting that real support and that engagement from people out in the different cities across the UK and the big towns across the UK. So we work with Hayes and other organisations in some of our big cities such as Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool as some examples, to really make sure that people are connected in those cities and focusing what's important for them. Because the way that you may be able to respond to your skills shortage and your challenges around getting into schools and talking to people about the construction industry are different region by region. So what works in London might not work in Leeds, what works in Leeds might not work in Manchester. So it's really important to also get that regional and that countrywide perspective in the activity that you do.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlotte, that's absolutely fantastic. I think this question is probably more for you than for me. So the question has come in, how would you ensure that equality legislation is upheld during recruitment, e.g. positive action? Is that something
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. And this is a question that I would say that not only this sector is grappling with, but many others are grappling with. So I would give you a few recommendations around that. First of all, I would ensure that your whole recruitment process, right from the start of thinking about what does the advert look like, what's the job description, where are we going to place these, right to the end of we've made the final decision about who the hire is and how are we going to support them with onboarding, is reviewed from a full inclusion and diversity point of view. So every facet of it is considered from an inclusion and diversity point of view to make sure there's any barriers and bias removed from it. And if we look back to the slide that I shared about the funnel, which showed about practices, processes and mindsets, this is a great example of it. So that would be the process. The second is the practice, so making sure that what you've put within that process is actually delivered, and make sure that people that are taking part in the recruitment process, so your managers, your leaders, those that are doing recruitment, actually have been trained in how to recruit effectively, and also the challenges around the barriers and bias within their decision making within that process. Because it's one thing having a great process, but it's only as good as the worst person that's actually delivering it. So it's making sure that the people that you have recruiting truly know how to recruit. I've been working with a number of organisations across many sectors, and this is one of their biggest challenges around bringing people in from the business to recruit, but also making sure they have the skills to be able to recruit, interview effectively, and make final decisions to make sure there's no barriers or bias. When it comes to positive action, there are elements within legislation that say if you have a man and a woman who have exactly the same skills and competencies to be able to do the role, that if you are underrepresented in one group, then you can balance that a little bit out with making the decision around your recruitment. I would sort of challenge that and say, if you have two people that have exactly the same skills and competencies, I would say you need to look at your recruitment process again, because it should be really pulling out what the key skills are. But one area I would focus on and would encourage companies to look at is, rather than purely focusing on recruiting for that particular job, also look at recruiting for that wider team. So if you see that you have some gaps in skills and knowledge or insights and perspectives in that team, think about how you could balance that out a little bit more with the recruitment that you do.
Brilliant, thank you. And I would just add, as an aside, as Hayes, we have a very practical tool which we're publishing next month, which is our inclusive recruitment checklist. So again, please, please have a look at that on hayes.co.uk, because we think that's a really valuable tool, particularly for people who are looking at recruitment in the months ahead. Final question we have here, and I'm a bit mindful of time. This is about gender pay reporting, obviously very topical at the moment. So, question is, if gender pay reporting is only for the largest companies, how can it help an organisation less than 250 people? And I suppose the context of this, Charlotte, is many employers within the construction, property and sector would fall outside the 250, be more SME. Do you have a thought on that, or do you have any observations you would share around companies that don't have to do gender pay reporting, but how they could perhaps benefit from the current initiatives?
I have spoken to a number of organisations with less than 250 that have wiped the brow and say, phew, I don't have to do this. But actually, I think it's a good discipline, whether you have to report it or not. And there are some examples of smaller organisations, less than 250, that have publicly reported, because they want to set that tone to say, transparency is important for us. We want our potential colleagues to know what we're like. We want them to see how important this is to us. So we are going to report what we look like, regardless of whether we have to or not. So I think it's a good process for organisations to go through, regardless of size, to get a sense of what's really going on in their business. Because a lot of us say that the data and the insights shine a light on what we might not already know, and then it's for that organisation to have the conversation about, are we surprised about this information? What's concerning us? Is it hindering us getting the truly best talent in the across the country? Is it challenging us in getting different business opportunities from bigger organisations? So I would encourage any organisation to have a look at it, see what the data tells us, dig underneath it a little bit to find out what's going on in your business, and then it gives you a good starting point to say, if we haven't looked at this information and this stuff before, what is it that we could do differently to really make sure we're attracting the best?
Yeah, I have to say, I would certainly say from my personal experience, there's been a real sense, from research we've done elsewhere, that most of the candidates that we talk to have a real appetite for where companies are around diversity and inclusion, and we did a piece of research last year called the What Workers Want report. So my sense with this is, I think it isn't something, I can't remember what you said, but SME employees should hide away from, because I think on one level, potential candidates will want to know, or indeed people already working for them will want to know, so absolutely something to be engaged on. So mindful of the time, and I think we're coming pretty much towards the end of our slot, I'd just like to thank once again Charlotte for her insights in the presentation. Really grateful for you being able to join us today, so thank you very much for that. As you can see on the screen, there is a link there if you'd like a copy of the report. I'll just say again, I skimmed over, for the sake of the speed of the presentation, quite a lot of the detail. There's much more within the report, so please do have a look at that. And I think on a wider point, would be absolutely delighted, with any questions that you have, so please pick up offline, and we'd be very eager to hear your feedback on today, or indeed any sort of further questions you have. So Charlotte, once again, thank you very much, and very grateful for your time today. Thank you for everyone for listening, and enjoy the rest of your working day.